I've made 2 videos before about arguments that relate to slavery. For the most part, those videos weren't about how those arguments were employed historically, so much as how they're used today, not to justify slavery outright, but to diminish the evil which it represented. I wanted to shed some light on how the arguments functioned, to help us identify them in the wild, as it were, without falling prey to their rhetoric. Because sometimes these arguments, while I was discussing them in relation to slavery, can go a lot further, and they can be used to justify certain other negative behaviors today. And that has never been more true than for the particular brand of whataboutism that I want to talk about today, which, while I'm going to primarily, again, explore it through the lens of slavery in the British West Indies, it's absolutely employed on a pretty regular basis by agents both hostile and ignorant today. It is a distinct mixture of both practical and ideological concerns, the likes of which, even if utterly ridiculous in their nature, can prove difficult to work around and counter in a convincing manner. Now, I'm not going to be able to provide you with an answer on how to triumph over such an approach and bring people over to your side today, but I can at least explore how the argument functions and how we might identify it through a series of historical sources in this video brought to you by the Native Oak and our mission to promote the appreciation and study of history. You can find out more about that mission, how we donate 10% of all our profits to charity, and how you can support it all by visiting our website, nativeoak.org. Now let's get to that argument, which shall come to us from a barrel, in particular, this 1832 political cartoon featuring our proud abolitionist in the center, gesturing to the free English on his right and a poor, wretched slave family on his left. Think of the poor, suffering African called a slave, he says, unpossessed of any of the rights and privileges that you enjoy while you sit under the vine of your Reform Bill and the fig tree of your Magna Chart. He knows nothing of such blessings. Yet, when we look to the Britons with their civil liberties and their freedom, we see them destitute. Must an industrious and honest man starve, asks the wife, while the husband laments his poor wages and broken body? Yes, he says, unless he should take on the role of a beast hauling a cart, which, at the least, is fed by the parish. Their furniture is broken, and at their feet pile up the dreaded tax bills. Now compare this to the condition of the African slaves, smiling amidst exotic fruits while their compatriots sing and dance in the background. They speak not of taxes and labor and starvation, but of their happy child. This one's going to be tricky. Pickaninny, the father says, you eat yam, you belly full? Him beauty, Lila. To which the mother affirms, Sambo, he berry like you. Lot to unpack there, but the argument itself is fairly straightforward. Idealists will cry out about lofty-minded ideals like freedom and liberty from their soapboxes, or barrels, as it were, all the better to just drive home how crazy those abolitionists are, yet they are disconnected from the reality on the ground. This argument is appealing to the common people who are suffering. And rather than asking, why are these people suffering and what might we do to alleviate that suffering, well, instead it is deflecting that rightful anger and frustration outwards towards an external group, which is, in this case, distant and as such, little understood. You want me to care about the freedom of a slave? Well, look what fat, good freedom has done me. Meanwhile, they're over there getting fed, not having to pay taxes, having their housing provided to them. Maybe I'm the real slave here. They seem to have it pretty good from what I'm being shown. Alongside the victimizing, thus, of the white Briton, there's also the infantilization and stereotyping of the black African. Not only do you see those exaggerated racial features, but also in their language, which obviously is rather explicitly written to sound uneducated and broken. Again, it's just a stereotype, really. It's also a particularly tragic way, I think, to try and showcase how oh so well off these slaves were, you know, the happy family and all that, considering how exceedingly high, even by the standards of the time, how excessively high the infant and child mortality rates were in the West Indies, and of course given as well that it was quite common for women to be made just outright infertile from malnutrition and overwork. Now, if you'd like to learn more on that topic, about the reality of slaves in the West Indies during this time period, you'll find my last video on the topic linked below, including a few sources for my claims just now. So like I said, we have here a mixture of ideology, in this case the meaning of freedom itself alongside racialism, and practical concerns as well, the material concerns, the value of that liberty and what it means in the pursuit of a happy life, you know, aka what use is a liberty if I'm starving to death, right? What this is, effectively, right, is a Georgian-era stone toss cartoon. It's an appeal to emotion and stereotypes that help the viewer to feel like they're being practical. They're understanding the issue on a deeper level, not just engaging in these useless platitudes. And yet, it totally falls apart the moment you examine the actual conditions on the ground, you know, infant mortality, starvation, overwork, all that stuff, or the moment you refuse to accept the assumptions that are at its core. In this case, and also in the case with the stone toss as well, the assumption of racial superiority even just existing as a concept, right? And you know, ultimately, even if the slaves were all happy and prosperous and everything, you know, even if the way that the cartoon is showing them living was the case, very much not so, but even if it was, well, it would still be, at its core, serving to take existing anxieties, in this case, you know, about the price of eggs, as it were, and directing that anger instead towards a different issue altogether. The issue of abolition has very little to do with the wages of a workman in Britain. Obviously, it's connected. All of these things are connected, right? The global economy, blah, 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 blah. I understand that they are connected issues in a way, but it's not like it's a direct line, right? It's not like, oh, well, we need to keep the people enslaved in the West Indies, and that'll solve your problem at home. Well, it very clearly has not been solving the problem. Now, this cartoon is not outright saying slavery is good, but what it's doing is implying that there are bigger, more important issues, while, again, doing absolutely nothing, providing nothing by way of actual arguments about those issues, right? So overall here, we have three key components. You undermine the authority of your opponent, you downplay the severity of the situation in question, and then you redirect the anger of your base from a different issue to make it seem tied to this one. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Well, it probably should, and it will, because it's a very common tactic in politics, whatever your stripe. I just know for a fact that half my audience is saying, well, obviously, Brandon is referring to this issue. And the other half will say, well, obviously, it's the exact opposite issue, right? It's a very common tactic, whatever it is. The real trick here is picking up on it, not just when the other guy is doing it, but when your side is doing it as well. You know, it's also a real trick is finding a way to fit a sponsor transition into a video like this that's on a topic that's really serious in a way that is both respectful to the subject, acceptable to the advertiser, and doesn't immediately make the audience want to grab their pitchforks, as many have been wont to do in the past. Look, I gotta pay rent somehow, right? You know, I'm not really sure how I can do that this time around, but you know what? I think I have an idea who might know, so let's go and ask him. This video is sponsored by Exter. Hey, little Timmy, what's new with you?
Hi, Brandon. Not much. Currently stuck in a time portal from the last time you did an ad with me. You know, when you sent me from the Napoleonic era to the First World War. Well, turns out that messing with the timeline is pretty wonky business, so I've been here for a while now.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no trouble. It beats the mud. Anyways, how are you?
Well, I'm trying to think of how I can transition this video into an ad for Extra wallets. You know, the wonderful, sleek, and modern new style of wallet that just completely blows the old bifolds out of the water.
Oh yes, I know them. The ones that carry up to 12 cards, plus cash of course, with the delightful little quick card access button.
Yeah, that's them. You know, they're also secured, actually, against RFID theft attempts. And if you include this handy little finder card with them, they're almost impossible to lose because, well, you can just track it with your phone. I've had my Extra wallet for, it feels like ages now. It's held up really well, wonderfully really, and I use it every day.
Yes, Brandon, you've told me about Extra and their amazing sales. For example, their current New Year sale where people can get up to 40% off, plus unlocking additional savings, of course, when they use your code BrandonF at checkout. And haven't you done this whole, oh, I need help thinking of an ad bit before? You know, it's all just starting to feel a little bit tired.
Oh, well, darn, I guess you're right. I really do need a fresh idea. Oh, I know. So we're in a time portal, right? Well, who's to say that I can't use this portal then to reach through not just to another time, but to another dimension? Maybe I can find someone new out there to proselytize the glories of Extra to. You know, that could make for a pretty good ad. You know, people love this whole multiversal galaxy MCU stuff, right?
Sure, man, it's your universe. I'm just endlessly suffering in it.
Yes, to the alternate universe, away!
Oh dear.
Thank you to Extra for sponsoring this video. Remember to check them out during that New Year's sale and use code BrandonF for additional savings. Now let's get back to the video. Let's look at another example of this rhetoric being used. Here we have a rather busy cartoon as John Bull takes a clear view of the Negro slavery question. While the horrified British public gazes through their spyglass to the West Indies, a raving abolitionist holds up a brutal view of a whipping, the likes of which are being sold by the crateful, alongside abolitionist pamphlets and very lucrative speaking gigs. Hey, there's that bucket again. Huh. Meanwhile, of course, bookish and spindly little abolitionists are collecting signatures from children for their anti-slavery petitions, which oh so happens, of course, to encourage the trade in British East India tea. You know, you really should only be buying tea from the East Indies. It's so much more pure and moral, unlike that vile, sinful West Indian slave trade-produced tea. Oh, I'm sure there's no conflict of interest going on here whatsoever. No, don't be ridiculous, not at all. And don't you dare to suggest otherwise either, of course, you evil slaver. And of course, through this whole tragic scene, we have a poor homeless laborer whose children are hungry, being ignored by them all. Oh, these terrible, terrible so-called abolitionists. Behind the facade, behind the massive business that is the abolitionist movement, well, what is the reality of West Indian slavery? Why, it's a regular old party over there, a cornucopia of dance and merriment. Again, we have the exact same themes. This one in particular really driving home that, you know, being a part of this anti-slavery elite can be really big business. So because some unscrupulous persons are making bank off of this stuff, well, surely then that must mean the entire movement is completely without merit. Maybe the issue itself doesn't even really exist at all. It's just a big old money-making scheme. It's a grift, it's a scam, it's a bit of a jump maybe there, but again, probably a jump in logic that sounds pretty familiar because we see it all the time, even today. This was a common sentiment in the 18th and early 19th centuries, being echoed in books like The Practical Rules for the Management and Medical Treatment of Negro Slaves. It's quite a book, what I can say, but it introduces itself by saying how few subjects have engaged more of the public attention or been productive of so warm a contest of pens as that of the slave trade, the proposal for its abolition having occupied the deliberations of Parliament more or less for 12 successive sessions, and given birth to an innumerable swarm of pamphlets, tending more to the emolument of the booksellers than to the edification of the public. Nor does that same text stop at the material concerns behind the abolitionist movement, but the author looks to what he claims is their ideological hypocrisy, describing how it's being driven by these clergymen who never seem to rely much on their own holy books, because the New Testament doesn't mention slavery much at all, and the Old Testament, rather, is very much in favor of it. It appears, therefore, he says, that slavery is prohibited by philosophy, not by theology, and I am doubtful whether the principle upon which that prohibition is founded may not, when urged to the extremity which it may fairly be carried, lead also to the condemnation of many other of the practices of men, which are now deemed perfectly consistent with moral rectitude. For who that denies their dominion over their own species will be so hardy as to dispute their empire over the rest of the animal world? You see what he does there? He's just redirected the question, decrying the opposing side, undermining them as he shifts the debate to a different question entirely. And rather than then engaging with that debate, the one over the differences between slavery and our treatment of animals, he instead just says, well, you know what? If we carry on this line of thinking, it's going to lead to an uncomfortable place. We'll just throw it all out because everyone knows we have to have dominion over animals. Of course, it's a given. As such, we don't even have to ask about slavery because it's the same question. He's making some pretty big assumptions here about what the opposing answers to these questions would be. Personally, as someone who is all three, an ardent meat eater, a believer in animal rights and animal welfare, and you know what? I'm against slavery to boot. Well, I would argue that he has glossed over all of these issues in a way that's a little bit much, but that is a whole other conversation. Many of these arguments were also, of course, rooted very deeply, and you've got a sense of it there, rooted deeply in racialist thought, whether that thought be the prevailing science of the time, as indeed part of it was informed by scientific thought, or if it's just the culture of the times, which is absolutely very much a part of it as well. More often than not, really, these two elements are mixing together, right? They're always informing one another to some extent or another. Science has a culture just like any other field of study, right? It may be a little bit less susceptible to it than, say, certain forms of the arts, but it's still obviously a factor, right? But my point is, whatever it is that is informing these people's views on race and how important it is or isn't, right? These people, whether they can be morally blamed or not for believing such a thing, they typically saw Black Africans as inherently inferior to white Europeans. We all know that, right? Historically, that was a very common thought. And this was almost always, obviously, of course, a core component of their arguments, which would naturally lead to many abolitionist talking points falling on deaf ears. Now, for example, the author of Observations on the Treatment of the Negroes in Jamaica has no issue whatsoever in making a comparison between our treatment of animals and of men, writing that while the Englishman might rely on an argument full of his favorite and perhaps prostituted theme of liberty, still, a Negro has no more idea of liberty, good sir, he says, than your horse. Both are equally disposed to roam at large without control, and provided they have plenty to eat and drink, they will not come near you. Take, however, either, he says, and break them in properly, accustom them to the bridle and occasionally to the whip, direct him to the road to which he is to go, and convince him by invariable practice of the good treatment and advantage he will experience at the end of his journey, and he will soon, unless he is vicious, not only bear, but love the task he has to perform, and instead of a desire to enjoy perpetual freedom, will receive more real pleasure from 1 day's liberty in the week than from 7. And if that is not the ultimate get-out-of-hell-free card, I really don't know what is. The author here is establishing a system by which, unless you attack it at the root assumption, at its very core, is basically impossible to otherwise disprove. No amount of comparisons of quality of life, no number of images showing the brutal punishment of the slaves. In short, no amount of material concerns will ever be able to convince someone who's approaching this question from a perspective of racial superiority, because they are viewing these people as no more than beasts, right? In short, without understanding the ideology at the core of these questions, there's no hope of genuinely swaying their believers. Prejudice is a powerful thing, and it allows us to accept things that we otherwise might find totally reprehensible. And we see this, born true in the exact same book, where at a later point, the author is describing the discipline and punishment of slaves, a topic, he says, which occupies so much on the minds of people at home, but he has a fairly easy answer for it. He says this of the matter. He says, "Were I to advance that punishments in this country are trifling and unfrequent, I should not only draw on myself the imputation of gross misrepresentation and prejudice, but in fact assert what is not founded in truth. Punishments are certainly very frequent, and, to a mind actuated by compassion alone, these punishments are a source of constant pain. To me, I freely confess, they were very distressing on my first coming to this island, and even at this time, after having reasoned on the necessity, and let me add, the propriety of certain punishments, the crack of the whip seldom fails to operate on my nerves like an electric shock. But let us not be carried away by mere sensibility." He's admitting there that even the sound, the cracking of the whip, is a shock to his system. The abolitionist, then, can point out to this cruel treatment of the slaves all they like, and evidently it won't connect. They can espouse the values of liberty and freedom all they like. It won't connect. Not unless the assumptions of the pro-slavery crowd are addressed at their very core. Those, the belief of slavery being a natural state of humanity that there's no point in combating. That was another very common view at the time. And of course, in the case of the transatlantic slave trade, that of the racialist worldview, which considers black Africans as subhuman. But I'm detracting, I think, a little bit from the original point, because we're now dealing more with people who have already been seduced by those bad arguments. I'm trying to explore the rhetoric that is seeking to convert these individuals in the first place. And that rhetoric, again, being to claim that abolitionists are exaggerating the severity of slavery in pursuit of selfish reasons, primarily a profit incentive, and that while they decry the woes of the slaves, there are people at home suffering far more whom we need to be giving our attention to, because after all, the slaves are nowhere near important as we are, and while the abolitionists are demanding that we break our backs to free them, they aren't even intelligent enough to appreciate it. Like I said, this is a very severe case of whataboutism at its core. This line of argument wasn't limited to the British West Indies either, of course. That's just what I've been focusing on for this video. But for another example, one anti-abolitionist book in the antebellum American South was a reply to Uncle Tom's Cabin, titled Uncle Robin in His Cabin in Virginia and Uncle Tom Without One in Boston, which it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a version of the Uncle Tom story where Tom, who runs away, ultimately becomes destitute in the North, where those highfalutin Northern Yankee abolitionists don't actually care about Tom. They're just using him for their own causes, right? Meanwhile, we have Uncle Robin down south, who is loyal to his master, and as such, he lives a happy life even without his liberty. Again, same exact three components: undermine, downplay, redirect, all being upheld by the two main legs, those of material and ideological concerns, both of which naturally tend to blend together while relying on a great deal of misinformation, being the flawed assumptions, the racialism and whatnot, as well as, of course, a misunderstanding of the genuine conditions on the ground, blah, 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 blah. and then of sophistry, mainly the prejudices which these arguments are affirming, and how they are making people feel like they're being the smart ones, they're seeing through the platitudes on the other side and whatnot, even if, the argument itself that the even if the argument that the sophistry is in favor of is demonstrably without merit. Again, this line of thinking is difficult to work around, really. It preys on ignorance, of course, but also on insecurities that are deeply rooted and often legitimate in one way or another, even if they're being used for illegitimate purposes. Like I said, price of eggs and all that, right? If you can take someone's genuine and understandable anger over a common issue and then redirect that anger towards something else, that's a very, very powerful tool and a very dangerous one as well, as I would argue we have seen borne out many, 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 many times throughout history, including today. Now, that redirection may even be based on flawed information. Maybe eggs aren't so expensive everywhere. Maybe the slaves aren't being treated that well after all. Maybe there are some, I'm sure there are some examples where they are, but there are many, many examples where they're not. The redirection may be based on flawed information, but all the same, the rhetoric, if you're using that sophistry, if you are playing to people's prejudices and stereotypes, blah, 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 well, it's really strong. It can convince a lot of people. It's a way to make people feel wiser, more intelligent, more important, and like they have some agency, some control, something they can focus on when their real problems are so much larger, more insurmountable, and frightening, right? Not being able to make ends meet is a frightening concept. In the case of abolition and slavery, unfortunately, this line of reasoning did convince many, many people, as it continues to do today for, I believe, a myriad of causes. And it does make me think that perhaps at some point a video on the view of the common man towards slavery, the views of those who didn't have a stake in either camp, abolition or preservation, that might be an interesting video in the future. And I absolutely have a lot of really interesting quotes, I think, that explore the depth of that, the spectrum of beliefs, so to say, that were in between the two extremes. But I don't want to dedicate more time today going through all of that. It's a whole other diatribe, and I have a feeling that this video is already a little bit too long and maybe a little bit more rambly than it should be. Now, unfortunately, I cannot provide any clear answers on how to combat this kind of argument, right? Again, it seems to be something that we are grappling with even today in our modern politics, and there is no clear answer on how to respond to it. But I think that being able to identify this rhetoric, to understand the logic that it's following, and again, being able to identify it not only when the other side is doing it, but when your team is doing it as well, that's all a very important first step towards making our overall political discourse, and indeed our historical inquiry, much more honest. And so I hope that through looking at some of these historical examples and exploring their meaning a little bit, this whole conversation, I hope that that has proven helpful in that pursuit, and that it hasn't just been my rambling interspersed with the occasional highly questionable quote. But in any case, you have made it this far, so thank you for the time that you have spent with me today. Special thanks are, of course, owed to those who made this video possible, my generous supporters on Patreon, without whom I would not be able to carry out any of my work, from book writing to video production and everything in between. Of course, if you'd like to learn more about any of that work, well, then you can visit my website, nativeoak.org, where you'll also find a wide variety of historical primary sources, all published as free PDF downloads, as well as our bookstore, where you can buy Something Like Philosophy, being an anthology series all about trauma and privation throughout military history. But I am dragging this along, and so my name has been Brandon Fischella, and on behalf of the Native Oak, thank you, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.